Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Review. Today, I want to take you guys through a game between one Fabiano Caruana and Garry Kasparov. Now, this is a game that actually sparked some controversy back in 2020, the year of the online tournaments, or at least the first year of the online tournaments. And today, we're going to look at a game that probably made Garry Kasparov go raw! Anyways, let's jump into it here. Garry has white here, and we're looking with Fabi with the black pieces. And the game starts with 1c4, c5, b3, b6. Now, wait a second. I may have forgotten to mention something. You may have noticed something has happened to all the pieces on the 1st and the 8th ranks, and that is because this game is from Chess 9LX or Chess 960, depending on who you ask. And they are, of course, playing with scrambled starting positions, with the only rules being the bishops have to be of opposite colors, and the king has to be in between the rooks to allow for castling rights. Now, both players started off pretty symmetrically, as you can see. And that's something you'll see a lot in Chess 960. The opening moves, the first couple moves, really do tend to depend on the bishops in many, many cases. In this case, the bishops are sort of pre-fianchettoed or pre-developed before the game even begins. So all that's left to do is open these nice long diagonals for the bishops to play on. And that is really the nature of the game from this point forward. We're going to see both players aiming to activate their own bishops while looking to not allow the enemy to shut their bishops out. So Garry continues now with knight g to f3, and we see Fabi playing the interesting knight e to f6. And it's a pretty interesting decision here by the two players. Fabi actually, I would say, developing with the less natural knight out to the f6 square, whereas Garry using the classical knight g1 to f3 idea. And the difference here, I think, is that Fabi is actually getting the better end of this deal here. I think Fabi saw a little bit further ahead with moving this e knight out to f6, because he understands that the fight is going to be for the d5 square. White, by virtue of having the first move, is already well prepared to play the move d4, which of course is very desirable. You want to keep these pieces open and threaten to lock your opponent's pieces out. Whereas black may actually have to fight for the d5 square. So why does this help fight for the d5 square? Well, we actually allow the g knight to develop out to e7 instead. Whereas that's not a luxury this knight on e1 is going to have. And perhaps we'll see that this knight, while it does have some natural developing squares, is going to be in the way of white's own pieces for some time here. In the game, though, we do see e6 by Fabi. Of course, we need to prevent this break through to d5, which would stunt the light square bishop. Garry continues now with kingside castles, this knight e7 move that I anticipated. Well, I didn't really anticipate. I saw it coming because I analyzed the game beforehand. Queen d2 by Garry. Now, knight g6 by Fabi. The d5 square is already firmly under black's control, and now it's just about using the pieces harmoniously. You see Fabi starting to build up the pieces on the king side, both knights and both bishops starting to stare down this side of the board. Knight d3 by Garry Kasparov. Garry continues the fight for the center, conversely. Now Fabi continues with queen e7, and we see both sides finishing development here. Rook fd1. Fabi snaps on the d4 square, deciding it's time to activate this rook as well. Knight takes d4, and finally kingside castles. So this is the first moment when I want to stop out of the opening and sort of assess how this has gone. So intuitively, it looks as if white's pieces are a little bit more centralized. So you might expect white to have some kind of advantage here. However, I do think it's actually black with the advantage. For the moment, black has not given up the d pawn for the c pawn, as white has. And this is actually going to give black a little bit of extra leeway in the center. There's also a very, very surprising break that you might not anticipate that black is able to think about here. And that is the break of potentially pushing e5 and e4. And like I said, it's going to be about the bishops here. And if black is able to achieve these kinds of moves, then these bishops are going to feel a little bit lackluster looking at the strong pawn, that is also kicking away these knights from their very strong outposts in the center. For example, e5, the knight moves around, a6, the knight has to come back, and then all of a sudden, both bishops are staring at their own knights, and this diagonal is a little bit blocked off as well. Meanwhile, black always has opportunities to push the pawn even further with things like e4 and e3, and still great attacking prospects on the king side. So Fabi, I think, definitely got the better of Garry out of the opening, but we'll see that Garry is actually able to start turning things around here in the middle game. So, how do we start with that? Well, Garry, perhaps realizing that there is some tension happening on the king side with these bishops staring down and the queen ready to launch in behind a knight, so he offers a trade of the queens, which prompts Fabi to decline with tempo with bishop d6, and this also prompts Garry to retreat as well. So kind of a slight maneuvering game going on here for a moment. Basically, Garry draws out Fabi's bishop to the d6 square, a square where it's not very comfortable opposite a rook, and uses this opportunity to reroute the queen to a more active post. Fabi now continues with rook f to e8, perhaps anticipating these e5, e4 breaks. And now we see knight b5 by Garry. This, of course, hits the bishop here and increases the pressure, so Fabi simply retreats. And now we're going to see what could have been the fatal mistake of the game by Garry, which is the move queen b4. Once again offering this queen trade, this time with the idea that bishop d6 is not going to be playable. And this, I think, really is the move of the game here. This is where Fabi goes from having some kind of advantage to a completely level playing field, in my opinion. And the problem is, Fabi missed actually a winning idea that many of you are probably familiar with at home. So if you want to pause the video here, find black to move and win, go ahead and take that chance. But here's the solution. Bishop takes h2. It's the prime opportunity for the Greek gift sacrifice. This king, with all of these three pawns still on their starting squares, really has no escape route through to the center. And due to that, knight g4 check is simply going to be crushing. The king comes back home, queen out to h4, and there's no way to deal with the threat of queen h2. You might expect that you can play the move queen d6, but then e5 locks this queen back out of the game. Similarly, there's no bishop to e5 ever, because the knights do well to cover that square. So white is simply busted here. Now, what was stopping black from doing this earlier? Well, Garry actually had the right idea with this queen on c3, so if Fabi were to attempt something like this a turn earlier, then king g1, queen h4, and the nasty move knight f3 is making a lot of threats at the same time. No time to take this knight off the board to renew the threat, because queen takes g7 is immediately on the board. So Fabi perhaps missing a winner there with bishop takes h2 in this position. That being said, he chose d6 instead, keeping the position alive, but after d6, like I said, the character of the game is about whose bishops are more active, and after d6, black is sort of playing catch-up in this regard. This bishop on b8 looking a little bit stuck. The game now continues with f3. Garry looking to take over the center a little bit more, keeping this knight out of any of these nasty squares that we were talking about earlier. Now a6 forces this knight back to d4. a5 takes some more squares on the queen side, and we see Garry retreat back to e1. Now, once again, Fabi perhaps has a slight positional edge here because he is able to manufacture the move d5. And once again, it's all about the bishops. White's bishops still looking at these knights, and black's bishops ready now to open up at a moment's notice. C takes d5 played in the game. Now knight takes d5, and we get a trade of rooks. Rook c1 by Garry, and now the game starts to slow down a little bit with the open C file. Not the only open file on the board, but really the only usable open file, as the D file is so clogged. Now we're going to see some major pieces fall off the board, and the game sort of steer towards more level territory. All right, so we get knight c6 played in the game. Garry, realizing that he needs to activate these bishops, uses this opportunity to actually take one of black's bishops and increase the pressure on the C file. Meanwhile, Fabi is not giving up on this kingside attack, activating the queen with queen g5. Now g3 by Garry is the defensive move to keep sort of all of these threats at bay. Things like knight e3 were starting to be in the air. And then we see Fabi once again take a wrong turn. We've sort of had this back and forth struggle in the game where Garry was trying to actually sort of equalize out of the opening. And Fabi misses the key opportunities to really seize an advantage. So what was the advantage for Fabiano in this case? Well, he actually missed an opportunity to really plug up all of the weaknesses in White's position. And Black could have done this here with the move knight g to e7. So not a natural move at all. Sort of a move that looks as if it's heading in the wrong direction, right? You want to increase the pressure on the king side, you want to attack on the king side, but the point of it is actually very concrete. You force White's rook to move. White's rook doesn't have too many places to go. Let's say it heads to the c2 square. Now we plant this knight on e3, this knight on d5, and these are two unassailable knights that can never really be driven away. This knight, a huge thorn in White's side. Meanwhile, these threats are always in the air, and Fabi's idea of h5 and h4 definitely could be seen at a later date. But these knights, really, really powerful pieces and could have been improved to the maximum here for Fabi. Meanwhile, Fabi actually decides to play this move h5, which again makes a lot of sense, but is just not going to be working quite fast enough. Garry uses this moment to take back control over this diagonal with queen to c1. Now these knight e3 plans are a little bit less convincing as the b6 pawn, number one, is hanging, and number two, the knight is already under some pressure. So we see queen e7 instead. Now rook c8, and Garry says, let's trade off a few more pieces. H4 by Fabi is trying to create some more weaknesses in White's camp, and then Garry has a pretty instructive response here. Facing these two attackers on g3, the answer Garry actually comes up with is to put more pieces on the dark squares with the move f4. And this is a great move to actually stunt this bishop and reduce its influence a little bit. It seems weird to defend the g-pawn by making the g-pawn, sort of critical to your position, right? You need this g-pawn to defend f4 now, but this is actually an effective way to block out the attackers against g3. From here, Fabi tries to activate a little bit with bishop d6. Garry now starts to invade with queen c6, and the tide is definitely turning once again. We see queen f8 by Fabi trying to regain control of the 8th rank. The rooks come off the board. Takes. Now queen c4 by Garry, and all of a sudden, the attack on the king side sort of seems to be faltering. Meanwhile, these two bishops have been sort of lurking back here for the entire game, and their influence is going to be felt pretty soon here. And Garry also has quite a mobile center with this e2 pawn ready to launch forward at a moment's notice. So bishop f8 played in the game, trying to activate the queen. Now we see bishop d4, and like I said, these bishops now springing into the game. And h3 by Fabi is going to be sort of the move that gives Garry a pretty decisive edge here. Fabi, perhaps in the rapid time control, was looking to get some cheapos, perhaps on the g2 square, but this h3 pawn is actually one step too far, and Garry finds the right idea, simply knight f2. And this pawn is indefensible. Garry just going to go up a pawn now, and this h-pawn was actually one of the most important attackers for Black. Without this h-pawn, it's going to be really tough to make any concrete threats against this white king. b5 played in the game for Fabi, and the point here is that if White captures on b5, we do have a small little tactic like this. Whether or not this tactic is even all that good is up for debate, but Garry chooses the more simple approach of just queen back to d3. Now knight b4 is trying to activate once again. Queen out to e4 now. A lot of pressure on this diagonal as well. Queen c7, and Garry simply picks up this pawn. Now, Fabi plays the move knight d5, and Garry, to his credit, also misses a win here, as Fabi had been missing for a couple moves earlier. So now Garry did have the move f5, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn is a little bit overworked. This move just would have been really strong. It really breaks down Black's entire position. Black, of course, is missing the light squared bishop, and so is relying on these two pawns to guard all of the light squares. And once these pawns start to tumble, then there's really no recovering. For example, f5, there are some complicated tactics here with queen c1 check, and he takes f5. But we're not really interested in taking the knight and hanging our bishop. We just want to loosen these light squares, and Garry would be absolutely crushing in this position. So instead of that, Garry chose the simple move again, queen d3, and now after bishop c5, we get the moment of controversy for the game. Of course, this was an online event in 2020, and here Garry had an unfortunate and rather unusual type of mouse slip, if you can call it. It wasn't exactly a mouse slip, it was more of a pre-move debacle. So Garry had actually tried not to play the strange move queen d3. Garry had attempted to play the much better move queen c2. Queen d3 does look a little bit odd, allowing things like queen c1 check and ideas of this nature. So Garry had actually attempted to play queen c2, fighting for control of the c-file, trying to get down to an endgame where the bishops will be even more powerful, and instead, the queen landed one square short on d3. Now that's bad enough, but not all is lost. White still has a good position, until you realize that Garry had tried to correct his move of queen d3 by placing the queen on c2 again. Inadvertently, Garry had pre-moved queen to c2. And after this, Fabi actually chose to play bishop c5 rather than queen c1. Then Garry's pre-move was enacted of queen c2, which of course undefends the bishop with check, and Garry was forced to resign the game. So not quite your typical mouse slip here, with Garry missing queen c2 with the typical mouse slip, but then even worse, creating an inadvertent pre-move. And this is how the game had ended. So up to this point, a really, really interesting struggle relating to the center of the board and how the bishops were playing against each other. But then the unfortunate end gives us the controversy of the tournament, basically, where Garry had the big mouse slip and I think was seen, I don't know, throwing some things, at least shouting on the webcam. We got to see, always fun to see Garry competing with those emotions, although we do prefer when those emotions are because of the chess actually being played and not because of the mouse mistakes. Anyways, that's it for today on Game Review. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.